And I will analyze if individuals and couples are more or less likely to retire when they are in couples, if they already have a retired partner, if this behavior differs by gender, and also if and how it was affected by the pandemic. And a quick overview of what I will talk about within the next 11 minutes. I'll start my presentation with a quick recap of what happened in the pandemic to motivate my research question. I will give a highlight of previous research on joint retirement, and after introducing my data and methodology, I will talk about my results. And a quick spoiler, I find a preference for joint retirement among couples because partners are indeed more likely to retire if they have a retired partner, irrespective of their gender. But this pattern changed during the pandemic due to the massive involuntary retirement. So as we all know, for the last 2 years, we saw hundreds of thousands of more workers retire than we would have expected based on the trend. And this fueled a narrative of a great resignation among workers. But our research actually showed that workers did not retire by choice, but that they were pushed out of the labor force and retired involuntarily. And right at the beginning of the pandemic, we also experienced a significant increase in the transition to unemployment among other workers. And we subsequently saw that many more workers retired out of unemployment and less out of employment compared to pre-pandemic times. And all these scenarios combined are a strong signal for an increase in involuntary retirements during the pandemic. And because the majority of this retirement surge was involuntary and unplanned, I came up with a research question thinking, how did these involuntary retirements influence spousal retirement decisions? Because as we know from previous research, partners actually influence each other's retirement decisions. And workers are more likely to retire if their partner has already retired, irrespective of gender. And this is because some couples have a preference for joint retirement, even if the partners are not of the same age. And so in heterosexual couples, the older partner is more often the man, and therefore women in couples often retire at an earlier age than other women, especially other single women. And several researchers confirm that married women are more likely to retire earlier than married men. And women are also more likely to exit the labor force to take up caregiving responsibilities within the household before officially retiring. And for singles, there is a tendency to retire later than individuals in couples for financial reasons, but also for social reasons. And I want to investigate how an unexpected shock, such as involuntary retirement that we experienced during the pandemic, influences the couple's retirement decision. And Courtney Coyle did something similar in 2004 with unexpected health shocks. And she analyzed the added worker effect of spouses following an unexpected health shock. And she found a small effect for men, but none for women. And she finds that men would actually increase their labor supply to compensate the financial losses because of the health shock of their spouse. And therefore, their likelihood to exit the labor force and eventually to retire decreases because of the spouse's health shock. Similarly, Johnson and Favreau also show that if a spouse retired because of a health shock, the worker becomes less likely to retire. And McGeary reached similar conclusions like Coyle, and she shows that women are the ones who respond to a spouse's health shock by increasing their retirement probability, while men do not respond. So from this quick recap of the literature, we see that the research on the strength and the direction of spousal influence on the retirement is far from being concluded. And I want to contribute to this discussion with my analysis on spousal influence on an individual's retirement decision during the pandemic. And I do this with 2013 to 2021 monthly panel data from the US Current Population Survey, and make use of this 484 scheme that the CPS provides in surveying individuals. This means that households are interviewed for 4 consecutive months, then have an 8-month break, and are interviewed for another 4 months, which enables me to follow one individual over a time span of more than 1 year. My sample includes singles and heterosexual couples with a spouse present who did not change their marital status over the observation period. I also restrict my sample on both spouses working in T-13 and the individual not being retired in T-12. This enables me to capture, first of all, potential job loss and also new spousal retirement. So I exclude all couples who already had a retired partner for a longer time. The pandemic data is additionally restricted on employment in March 2020. And lastly, I divide the sample into two age groups, 55 to 59 and 60 to 65. And in terms of sample size, the pre-pandemic observations are much more than those that I have for during the pandemic. For 55 to 59, I have roughly 105,000 observations during the pandemic and 1,800 before the pandemic, and 1,800 during the pandemic. And for 60 to 65, it's 81,000 before and 1,600 during the pandemic. And just keep these sample numbers in mind when looking at my regression results, because of course, sample size matters for significance. And for the methodology, I perform an OLS regression on retirement status to estimate the effects of one's individual employment status and also the individual's partner's employment status, denoted with I for the individual and P for the partner, and the effects of these employment statuses in T-12 on the individual's retirement status in time period T. And I interact both of these variables with a dummy for being a woman to investigate the gender effects. And I additionally include a set of controls for age, marital status, education, race, ethnicity, industry, and occupation. And because I want to treat involuntary retirement as an unexpected shock, I proxy it with the COVID-19 pandemic and include a dummy for COVID interacted with the whole equation. So here's a quick look at how the sample looks like regarding the spouse's employment status. We see that most men and women in their late 50s have an employed partner, and the share decreases for the older age group. Among both age groups, women are more likely to have a retired partner, while men more often have a partner who is not in the labor force, and women are more likely to be single than men among both cohorts. And this first table shows the effects of one's own employment status on the retirement status by age group and by pandemic period. The first two columns show the results for the younger cohort, ages 55 to 59, and the last two columns for age groups 60 to 65. Columns 1 and 3 show coefficients for the pre-pandemic period, which covers 2013 until 2020. And columns 2 and 4 show the coefficients interacted with the COVID dummy. And this setup allows us to see significant changes caused by the pandemic. So let's start with having a look at the pre-pandemic times. And here we see that both age groups have the same statistically significant results, which are that having a job but not being at work last week, being unemployed or not in the labor force are all statistically significantly and increase an individual's risk to retire. Also, being a woman increases the likelihood to retire, and the interaction terms between employment status and gender, however, remain insignificant. And the interesting part here is that during the pandemic, two of these results flip, because now having a job but not being at work last week actually reduces the risk to retire during the pandemic for the younger age group. Because before the pandemic, people who had a job but did not show up at work were stuck at home for caregiving reasons or had health issues themselves. And these circumstances could become permanent and usually signal a high risk for retirement. But during the pandemic, like, these dynamics changed. So if you were not going to work, this did not mean that you had any underlying issues, but just because remote work setups were not yet common and people could not go to their workplace. So people did not show up at work, but not because they wanted to retire or had a higher risk for retirement, but because they could not show up at work. And the same pattern can be seen for those not in the labor force in the older age group. Again, while being out of the labor force increased the risk of retirement before the pandemic, it now considerably decreases the risk to retire during the pandemic. And my second table shows the effects of the spouse's employment status on one's own retirement status, again, by age group and by pandemic period. And again, I want to start by looking at the pre-pandemic results. And we can see that having a partner who has a job but was not at work last week decreased the likelihood to retire, which hints at an added worker effect to compensate financial losses. However, for women, it increased the likelihood to retire, which again would hint at a preference for joint retirement. And interestingly, having a retired partner statistically significantly increased the likelihood to retire among both age groups and irrespective of gender. And in particular, it's women ages 60 to 65 who are more likely to retire when having a retired partner compared to men in the same age group. And single women, on the other hand, are less significantly likely to retire than single men. And if we compare the pre-pandemic trends to pandemic, we again see that the most striking result during the pandemic is that a retired partner significantly decreases the likelihood to retire for the younger age group. And this indicates that unexpected shocks in the form of involuntary retirement reduce the probability to retire. And the same pattern shows for women ages 60 to 65 with a retired partner. Also, their likelihood to retire decreases substantially during the pandemic. And similarly, having a partner who's not in the labor force decreases the likelihood to retire for the younger cohort, and also for the younger cohort, the decreasing effect for single women
Hi, Barbara, just a few seconds, please.
Is even stronger during the pandemic. Just quickly here, I also showed that the results for people with care responsibility flipped during the pandemic. So people performing care work are now less likely to retire than before the pandemic. And this is it. This is just a slide concluding that an unexpected shock, such as an involuntary retirement, actually decreases the risk to retire during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Monique. Sorry about that.
Sorry, I have slides, but I don't think I'm going to share them. I'll share them with Barbara afterwards because I am afraid of using up my time kind of futzing around. Okay, let's see. First, I just wanted to say, now I lost my slides to myself. That's not good. What did I do here?
Don't worry, Monique, that's what happens.
Okay, no, I got it. Okay, so first I want to say that it's conventional to say that this was a wonderful paper, and it's conventional to say it's timely and important research, and usually the discussant might be saying that and they don't really mean it, but I really think this is timely and important research. And I'm not going to follow up with a critique of the methodology because I can assure you that the people who wrote this know more about the econometrics than I do. So what I do want to do is make a plea for why this really matters and why this is just wonderful research and very useful. Well, first of all, it overlaps with three areas of concern. One is retirement insecurity. Another one is the impact of job loss at older ages. And the third is the impact of the pandemic on the labor supply. And all of these things have been getting a lot of attention recently. And especially when it comes to women. And as a broader thing, women are in big trouble when it comes to retirement, and it's not because they're not trying. So women's labor force, women's participation in retirement plans is more or less caught up with men, with working men, conditional on working. And yet we know that women are still at much greater risk of financial insecurity and poverty in old age because they earn less, because there are caregiving gaps in their employment, and because they live longer. And so a lot of people think, well, the solution to that, given that women are working, that they have gaps in their employment, they live longer, they should work longer. In theory, that helps on two levels because it builds up your savings and your benefits, including your Social Security benefits, and because your savings don't have to last as long. So any additional year does double duty in terms of improving retirement security. And especially for women who have worked fewer than 30 years, 35 years, or are younger than 70, because then your Social Security benefits, which are what really matters, are increased significantly for every year you work. So is that the solution? Now, there's a lot of people who I see on this call know that the problem with that is that a lot of times women don't have a choice about whether, women and workers in general don't have a choice about whether to work, either because of health reasons or caregiving reasons, or because they lose their jobs. And to the extent that they do have a choice, sometimes they choose to retire possibly sooner than they ought to, in order to retire with their older husbands. So this is the crux of the matter, is that women tend to be married to men who are slightly older and tend to prefer to retire at the same time. And as a result, you have this double whammy where women live longer, but they're retiring at a younger age. And so this has been a longstanding concern. The second reason that this research matters is because we all know also that there was a lot of job loss among older workers in recessions, and especially in this last recession. And the impact of job loss on older workers is much more severe. So older workers are usually less likely to lose their jobs during a recession, but those who do have a much harder time being reemployed. In this recession, they weren't shielded from the risk of job loss. So you have this high risk of having problems getting rehired due to age discrimination or other factors. And you have, but you also don't have the protections that usually older workers have. In fact, in a typical recession recently, I mean, they're like the Great Recession, which is atypical in its size, but typical in its pattern, you actually see an increase in labor force participation by older workers during a recession because the asset prices fall and workers hang on to jobs. So they're less likely to retire. We did not see that during this recession because we saw massive unemployment, including among older workers. And the unemployment led to at least, if not an increase in formal retirement, at least an increase in exit from the labor force. And the reason I say at least is that it's a little fuzzy because we all saw a drop in employment, some of which was caused by death, by the way, which is terrible to say, but that was part of it. But we also didn't see what we would have expected in terms of a tick up in Social Security take up. So anyhow, so this is a big concern. But again, the pandemic recession was very different. Older workers weren't shielded from layoffs. We saw an increase when we looked, and this is actually, I credit the other Sia and Barbara and other researchers at SEPA have done a wonderful job laying out it's sort of a bimodal pattern. You have two groups of workers that disproportionately lost their jobs, and they were relatively younger older workers in low-income jobs, or relatively privileged over 70 white male professional types who are working part-time. So, but in both cases, you have part-time work. It may not have as big of an implication if those older workers were just sort of part-time. They didn't really need the money. They were just doing it because they're professional. But it is a big concern if those younger workers, and it's particularly women, are exiting for sure. So anyhow, I think I've used up more than my time, but I want to say that this is, all of these reasons are why Sia and Barbara's research really matters, because they are showing that the pattern is different during the pandemic. We've all been curious about it, and they've documented. They confirmed that the usual pattern holds, is that women tend to retire sooner with men, but this time they didn't. And the reason is that the men were probably retiring for reasons that are atypical, and the women were reacting to their retirement for reasons that are atypical. So this is not a typical pattern. On the other hand, we are worried that it might be an enduring pattern because the pandemic's not going away, and because we have long COVID and we have all kinds of other things. So it's really too soon to tell what the long-term repercussions are of the pandemic, but this is a very, very useful and very interesting first stab at figuring out what at least is happening with women. And I apologize for talking so fast. I'm really excited about this research, and I look forward to more discussion later. Thanks.
Well, it's really great when a discussant can summarize the paper, like even better, than the paper giver. It rarely happens. It was really terrific. Maybe this is good news for women. We have 2 more minutes. Anybody have a comment? Barbara, is this good news for women?
I'm not sure if it's good news, but I have to investigate that, but it definitely is good news in terms of self-determined decisions from women. Yeah, really interesting. And you were going to look at bargaining power too, and so I guess that has implications for that as well. Exactly. Like how much of these decisions are influenced by intra-household bargaining power, and how this intra-household bargaining power is generated among the couples. Yeah, I mean, we tend to, in empirical work, kind of skip over the underlying model
of the decision-making process, but I know that Barbara will be doing that for her dissertation. And it's really important for us to be not just coefficient readers, but also to really specify what our models might be. And I really like that you look at other literature in psychology and sociology as well. All right, let's go on to our next paper. I understand that Jose is going to present it. And go ahead, Jose, and bring up your slides. And nice to see you.
Okay, nice seeing you, Teresa. Thank you for organizing. And thank you for SIPA for putting together this session. I'm gonna present, you can all see my slides here? Okay, so I'm gonna be presenting this paper with two co-authors of mine, Aida, Farmand, and Feridoon Koohi-Kamali, entitled The Duration of US Joblessness and the Great Recession. Basically, the idea here is that, of course, the time spent in unemployment have different determinants. One can think of, for instance, public policy in the form of Social Security and other unemployment benefits. One can think also about socioeconomic characteristics. For instance, gender is a really well-researched subject. And also we have, of course, macro determinants of the amount of time someone spends on unemployment status. For instance, recession, of course, plays a determinant role here. Of course, the summation of each factor or how much each factor contributes to the time spent in unemployment is important because it's going to shape design, help us understand recessions and also to design better economic policy. And we focus especially here in the Great Recession period, which is of course the last recession we had before the pandemic. And we pay a special attention to the impact of gender and race in the unemployment patterns. When it comes to data, we are using the Displaced Workers Survey, which covers the period 96 and 2020. Shortly, it's going to be available the survey for the pandemic years. And one of our intentions is to expand this work to cover also the most recent recession, which is the pandemic. Well, the literature review is really enormous, gigantic. I'm gonna just highlight some topics that are commonly discussed. First of all, when it comes to gender, it's normally found that women's joblessness is lengthier. Sometimes people often explain this finding saying that there is a high reservation rate in the case of women and less job opportunities for them to get out of the unemployment status. Education also is really well researched. There is, in that sense, there is a mixed evidence. In the one hand, higher education means more opportunities, but also less education jobs have a higher turnout rate. So people get out of the unemployment quicker. And when it comes to the Great Recession themselves, previous research have found that the recession changed the unemployment rates and the unemployment patterns. That especially had an important effect on the gender gap. So this paper by Sahim and co-authors from 2010 is really important in that sense. And also there were some discussions about the long-term unemployment. And as you recall, that recession was also labeled the jobless recovery because it took much more time for the employment rate to recover from the worst part of the recession. I'm not, no. So this paper's goals are four. The first idea is that we would like to study the exit conditional on the time spent unemployed. So the fact that the chances of you getting employment is determined by the time you spent unemployed. Also, we want to study and estimate the effect of the Great Recession on the joblessness determinants. We try to address the multiple transitional routes out of the unemployment, that is the part-time jobs and the exits of the labor force altogether. And we also try to reassess the importance of some of the social demographics covariables. As I said previously, we use 24 years of the displaced worker survey, which is an appendix for the current population survey. We are talking about mainly displaced workers here, which are defined as people who lost or left their jobs because of their plants or company closed or moved, insufficient work for them to do, or their position was shifted and or abolished. It covers people from 20 years and older and more, who have been displaced from his or her job in the last 3 years. Particularly important is the fact that it covers multiple labor market outcomes, the full-time, the part-time, and the exit from labor force, and includes several factors like here are some examples of those: earning losses, duration of employment and employment benefit behavior, socioeconomic status, and so on and so forth. So it's a really rich data set that we are using. Barbara was using the current population survey in her paper as well. So it's a really well explored data set. And talking a little bit about the econometric model here, we use the hazard models, which are models that say that the unemployment spell is a function of time, so the duration, and some covariates. So if you look at this equation here, we see how that the time and the covariates add together to explain the time the person spends unemployed. And we tackle two specific, more technical problems here. One is the impact of recessions and expansions, which bring heterogeneity for our model, right? So meaning that, for instance, gender may have a role during expansion, but a different role during recession. So we tackle this problem by including this V variable here, which is a variable distributed as a gamma function form. The second problem that we tackle is the dependence on the functional form. So which means that we're going to also estimate a semi-parametric form that doesn't depend on the exponential or the Weibull distributions. And thus, when we compare the results we get from the different estimations, we have a sense of if our results are more or less robust or not. And then moving to the results. I put the tables here, but
minute left.
Okay. So let me just skip for the main results. The covariates here, gender, we found that men have a lengthier spell, and unemployed benefits lengthens the joblessness in 64%. Age, of course, is also a very important factor, extending the employment period. Let me move forward here. What we found about the recession is that it impacts all the variables. It increases the effects of education, gender, and marital status. Decreases others, like for instance age, and particularly is very important. The unemployment benefits are no longer relevant when we take recessions into account. And then we also have like results when we talk about multiple exits. I think if I should pick one of these results, I would say that for Black people, the lower rates of exit of both full-time and part-time jobs, and high probability of staying in employment. So And here are the conclusions. Let me just stress that the idea is really to build a framework to use also when we deal with the pandemics once the data is available in some weeks from now, I believe. So that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Jose.
much.
Karen, comments? I don't know if you've used this data set before. Sorry about that. And you're on mute, just to let you know. Feridoon, did you want to say something? Okay. You're on mute as well, Feridoon. Feridoon, you're on mute. And Karen, you're up whenever you want to do your slides.
Barbara, you should be able to unmute people because you're a co-host.
Oh, okay. I think Karen's probably having some trouble with her computer, given that it was acting up before. Feridoon, did you want to say something? You must be having trouble unmuting yourself as well. Feridoon, we can't hear you.
How about now?
Yeah, because you're unmuted. Yes.
Right. Very quickly, Jose, could you put the table 2 on the screen if it's possible, please? Yeah, I just want to draw attention to the way in which we've looked at some of the unobservable influences. For instance, you have a key variable here is impact of unemployment insurance on the duration of unemployment. And that fact might be influenced by some of our unobservables which are not in the model. For example, some might not take up because they're taking advantage of, say, for poor household, food stamp program that disqualifies them. We don't have that information in the sample. And that makes the estimate for the impact of unemployment insurance on duration of unemployment biased. Now, there are 2 ways of looking at that. What we try to do is to actually add a component to the hazard function.
Not fair to take up more time for your presentation. Karen now is going to do her discussion. but thank you. That was really interesting.
Sorry,
No,
I'm really having trouble with my computer. I have
Sure.
slides, but I think I'm not even going to be able to show them. So,
Go
like
ahead.
Monique, I'm just going to talk from them. The interesting thing about this paper is it compares a lot of econometric methods and has a long discussion, or a really nice discussion about some of the limitations of the discussions, and then shows a comparison of the results. So I found that very interesting. Was really trying to focus on the age, race, and gender impacts of unemployment duration. The most interesting piece of it was described in table 4, which Jose didn't actually get to show you. And it showed about conditional probabilities of going full-time employment, part-time employment, remaining unemployed, and exiting the labor force. Some of the interesting results from that are, well, men have longer unemployment spells than women. Unemployment benefit increases unemployment duration. Older workers are less likely to return to full-time employment, but more likely to go into part-time employment. And women with children are more likely to just drop out of the labor force. All those results make sense to me.
Yeah.
I think my biggest complaint about the paper is that I think the language in describing the results is a little bit, sometimes they talk about, they're not consistent with the language in how they're describing the results that make interpreting it a little bit hard with the coefficients. I was just going to suggest adding some more information about how to take the coefficients and convert them into probabilities and be consistent with the language. I also found, I also was thinking it would be useful to add some year dummies into the regression to try and get at period effects that aren't currently in the paper. And lastly, there's an age variable in there, which is over age 55. Main problem with that is it really misses the fact that people like 62 and older could be getting Social Security, and 55 and older is just too big a group. So expand the regressions to have more detailed age specifications. Age lines work nicely, and definitely try to compare something about Social Security, deal with Social Security. There's also a question on the survey that asks whether or not your unemployment benefits were depleted or exhausted. I would add a dummy variable for that. I think that could provide some interesting results. Anyways, I thought the paper was interesting. I think the writing needs to be a little bit clarified, and I needed a little more help as a reader understanding how to interpret the results. And that, I guess my biggest disappointment is the results I found the most interesting. The authors said, well, take these with a grain of salt because we're not sure about them. So I'd like you to get more sure about the table 4 results and report back later. Thank you.
That's great. That's great. Just get more, yeah, get more sure of it. Wonderful. Any other comments? Perhaps you can share your slides with the authors, Karen.
Yes, I'll do that. Yes.
And
I also have more detailed comments. I'll share those too.
Okay. And Feridoon, I interrupted you just because I wanted to get make sure Karen had some time. Do you want to say something more? Again, you're on mute. The curse of Zoom.
If you could just put up table 2, Jose, please, quickly. There is an interesting feature there, especially in regard to the comment, the last comment, is that if you look at the estimates in by the 3 different models, they're all very similar. The first model, the first row, assumes that the duration of unemployment is independent of time. Time has no impact on how long you've been unemployed. The second one has a parameter which assumes that the exit from unemployment depends on the duration of unemployment, how long you've been unemployed. Third one, as Jose explained, it does the same thing non-parametrically, meaning that it tries to estimate the model regardless of whether or not you have parametric misspecification. You fitted the wrong kind of model. All 3 of them are similar. And that's important for unobservable effect that I mentioned earlier. Why? Because the unobservable effect difficult to isolate if time variable of the model in the middle is actually significant, because then the 2 get mixed up. If, however, they're not significant, as the table suggests, then you could just simply go with the simple, timeless, memoryless, as it were, duration model, and that supports. I think that seems to support that we've actually had some success.
Thank you. Truc, that's now your turn to present.
Hello, everyone. My name is Truc. I'm a PhD student at the Tulane University, and today I will present my paper, Evidence on the Impact of COVID-19 Pandemic.
Truc, your audio is a little bit scratchy. Is there anything you can do to improve it?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
How about now? Is better?
That's much better. Yeah, thank you.
My paper is about the evidence on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and recession on the labor outcomes among older workers. So this paper tried to answer 3 key questions. The first one is that did the COVID-19 pandemic recession hit the older workers harder than the younger one or not? The second one is that what are the heterogeneous impact by sex, race, and ethnicity among the older workers? And the last one is that did the COVID-19 recession hit the older worker differently from other recession? So the motivations for this paper is that the first one is that the older worker have the highest risk of COVID-19 infection. That will reduce their labor supplies. On the demand side, we can see that beside the business closure, we also find that previous studies found that the age discrimination increased and the effectiveness of the protections are decreased during the COVID-19. That may have an impact on demand of older people. This is the reasons why I compare the labor impact between the older and the younger workers. Another motivation is that the socioeconomic status, the healthcare access and exposure to COVID-19 viruses varies across the gender, the race, and ethnicity. That's why I look at the different among all these groups when I only look at the older workers. And the last one is that in the previous study, they discussed that the COVID-19 recessions are very different, is very different from another previous recession. It's not only affect the economic performance, but it's also affect the health condition. That is the reasons why I compare COVID-19 with the previous recession. So the monthly data I use in this paper is the monthly CPS data. And in my original idea, I will try to analyze 4 or 5 different outcomes. However, in the presentation, I just focus on 2 of them, is that the labor force participation rate and the unemployment rates. So my method is pretty simple. I just calculate the mean of each outcome by a different group, and I compare among this group and across the recession. And so in my paper, I have a focus on 3 key age groups. 25 to 44 is a younger group, and the older group including 55, 64, and 65 plus. So try to answer the first question. Did the COVID-19 hit the older worker harder than the younger one? The short answer is yes. So first of all, I want to talking about the labor force participation rate. So the graph you are looking at is the percentage point change, the one on the left-hand side, and the percent change on the right-hand side of the labor force participation rate. And the baseline here is the average rate in the year 2019. And I have the percent change and percentage point change from January 2020 to December 2021. And we can see that in the left graph, the youngest group, the age 25 to 44, they have the largest degree. That is over 3 percentage point degree relative to the baseline. However, they are not the one have the largest percent change. The 65 plus one is the one have a larger percent change by degrees by 10% relative to the baseline. So this can explain by the fact that the labor force participation rate of the youngest group, 25 to 44, is much higher than the one with the older group of 65 plus. And if we can see the recovery in the December 2021, we can see that in the right graph, the percent change of the group 25 to 44 and 55 64 is just under 0. It's like allowed under 2% degree compared to the baseline. However, for the people in 65 plus, they are 5% degree relative to the baseline. So based on that, I can see that the oldest worker, 65 plus, they will hit the hardest. They will more likely to leave the labor force, and they less likely to come back to the labor force in the December 2021. So what happened for the unemployment rate? So this is the unemployment rate by 3 different groups from January 1976 to December 2021. And the gray area you guys seeing here is the recession area. So you can see that before the COVID-19 recession, even in the previous recession, the unemployment rate of the youngest group is always higher than the older group. But what happened in the COVID-19 is very interesting. This is the first time since 1976, the unemployment rate of the oldest people, 65 plus, surpassed that of the youngest one, 25 to 44 group, and peaked at 55.5%. However, in the April 2020. However, after that, all 3 groups decreased significantly, and they come back to the previous pre-COVID patterns that the younger group have a higher unemployment rate than the older one. So from this graph, I see that the oldest one, the 65 plus, they are hit the hardest during the COVID-19. However, they recover really fast, even faster than the younger one. So to answer the second question, what is the heterogeneous impact by sex, race, and ethnicity? I just focus on one measurement, is the unemployment rate. And this is an analysis for among the people 65 plus. So the graphs show you the percent change in the unemployment rate relative to the baseline. So the baseline here, again, the similar, the average rate in the year 2019. And I have 4 different race and ethnic groups, white, non-Hispanic, Hispanic, and Black, and Asian. So the Black and solid light, the Asians show you that in the May 2020, their unemployment rate increased by 700% relative to the baseline. That's a huge increase. Relative to 400% for the non-Hispanics and Hispanic. And surprisingly, the Black have the smallest one, 200% relative to baseline. But what happened in the at the end of the year 2021? Here in December 2021, except for Asian, all other groups that have a percent change is negative level. It means that the unemployment rate in December 2021 even lower than the average rate in the year 2019. It means except for Asian, all other groups already recovered, even it's a lower level than the baseline. It means the Asian people are they're hit the most, but they recover really slowly compared to another group. So in this graph, I didn't show the gender effect. However, in my paper, I found that the Asian, especially the Asian men, have the largest increase in unemployment rate, but except for Asian, in another own race and ethnicity, I saw that women were hit harder than men. Okay, and then move on to the last question. How did really COVID-19 hit the older worker different from another recession? So here is, again, I just focus on unemployment rate, U3 rate, and I analysis among 65 plus people. This is a percent change in the unemployment rate, and the baseline here is the rate in the first month of each recession. And I have here is 5 recession. So the COVID-19 is the solid light. And you can see that here in the picture, the huge difference between the COVID-19 and another recession. COVID-19 hit the older workers, especially here 65 plus, really fast and really hard. They increased by 400% compared to another recession. The largest one is just recession 1980 is just over 100%. But what happened to them in the descent, like 20? So I have a data until December 2021. And this is 22nd month since the first month of the COVID recession. And we can see here at this month, the percent change is negative. It means that the unemployment rate is under, even below than the rate in the first month of recession. So we can see that the older people that recover very fast within 22 months in the COVID-19. But that's not the pattern in other recession. So we can see, for example, in the recession 1980, they were increased by 100%. However, after 80 months, they haven't still falls to the same level at the rate in the first month of its recession. So what happened for the gender? So this is the similar graph, is the percent change in the unemployment rate, and the baseline is the month in the rate in the first month of its recession. And I do the 4 pair comparisons, COVID-19 with each recession. And the solid light is the COVID-19, the dashed lines is another recession, the red one is the woman, and the blue one is man. So we can see that except for COVID-19 recession and Great Recession, and other recession, we didn't see the large gap between the men and women in the increase in terms of percentage in the unemployment rate. However, the COVID-19 and recession, we can see that women were hit harder than men. But the gap between the women and the men in the Great Recession is much more smaller than the one in the COVID recession. So for example, in the April 2021, we can see that the difference between the men and women is around 200%. But that's very interesting is that after 22 months, the women even have the same level of percent change to the man. And that's mean that although women work harder, they will recover.
Hi, Truc. Can you wrap up real fast?
Yes. And so to my conclusion, to answer the first question, yes, the older worker worked harder than the younger worker during the COVID-19. The second one, the Asian, especially men, have the largest increase, but they recover slowly. And in general, women worked harder than men. The COVID-19 hit the older worker really bad, much more tremendous compared to another recession. However, they recover very fast compared to another recession. And the COVID-19 hit the women much more than men compared to the previous recession. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Confirming a lot of what we suspected. Thank you very, very much. Siavash.
So thank you so much for your paper. I'm going to repeat, Monique. It was very timely, and it's a very important topic. It's important for two reasons, maybe more than two reasons, but let me focus on two reasons. First of all, if I'm not wrong, and I just did the calculations again to make sure I'm not wrong. So those who turn 66 in 2020, those who turn 66 in 2020 are the last cohort with the full retirement age, Social Security full retirement age of 66. So starting from 2020, we are increasing Social Security full retirement age again to 67 years gradually. So pandemic happened right at the time that we are again telling older workers to work longer and longer and longer. So it is very important to see, like, at the time that we are advocating for working longer, and we are like putting in work policies that encourage them to work longer if they can actually work longer, and if the labor market has the capacity for people to work longer. And of course, the disparities are also very important, because we know who is more vulnerable at older ages, what workers are less prepared for retirement and depend more on their earnings from their jobs to survive, compared to those who are less reliant and can afford to retire. So by looking at disparities of COVID effect on labor market for these groups, we can get a better picture of what options they have, and if they can survive without their jobs. So I find what is very interesting, especially the length of unemployment story. Like we have done a lot of work on employment effect of COVID on older workers, specifically during the past 2 years. You have cited some of the research. There is a lot more. So I was more interested in parts that we haven't focused on, and length of unemployment is one of them. I'm sure Aida and Jose and Feridoon will include that in their future work when the data is available. But for now, we don't really have a good analysis of length of unemployment during COVID. So that was a very interesting angle for me, and thank you for adding that to the paper. I have a few comments. Maybe the most important one is the context of it. So for labor economists, it's very easy to talk about labor supply because we say that workers choose to work or not, like increase their supply or reduce their supply. We don't talk that much about demand because it's hard to observe and hard to measure and capture. For employment and unemployment during pandemic, it's a very delicate issue to know, like, where it's supply that's changing and where it's demand. And that's a question that I'm very interested in and focusing on it. So we should be careful when we see like change in employment and unemployment, not to assign it to changes in supply or demand specifically if we are not clear about that. So maybe like pay more attention to when you're saying that, okay, the supply is changing here, because maybe you're not sure if it's all supply. Maybe it's not just health concerns. Maybe there is also age discrimination. Like in one of the papers you cite, like WHO is like saying that, oh, we are very worried about ageism during COVID. So we have to be careful to be more inclusive, because we don't know what changes are from supply side, what changes are from demand side. Yes. The other thing that I think you should think about more a little bit is using the percentage change as a measure. So in one of the graphs, you show the differences in percentage point change and percentage changes. But I think using percentage change is a bit problematic for some of these issues, specifically when you are talking about differences in race and ethnicity, because you have differences in denominator.
Yeah.
So when you ignore the difference in the denominator, then you may see that, oh, Black workers were not that much affected by the pandemic. While I believe that it's completely opposite of that. Why? Because you are saying that they have smaller changes in unemployment rate. But if you flip that, you can see a larger portion of Black workers became unemployed because of the pandemic. So choosing these measures are a bit sensitive, and I think you can like go over all of them and see like which one requires a bit more thinking, like maybe change the denominator, or what portion of employees lost their jobs, instead of seeing that what's the increase in the number of unemployed. Because another aspect of it, it's also true for gender, because you may see that like, oh, like all 65 plus women have very low unemployment rates. So the changes for them will be very large, but that's because most of them retire when they lose their jobs. So the low unemployment rate for like women 65 and over doesn't really mean much. It doesn't mean that they have good job opportunities or anything like that. So the large increase in that doesn't give you a good sense of like what's happening to employment in that section. Are they more affected or less affected? Again, because of the problem, denominator. I have a list of comments. I can send it to you later. But thank you.
Maybe just take a breath and see if anybody else wants to say anything. Are you just trying to say they should use labor force participation rates? And I know Matt is coming on, he wants to say something, so.
Employment rate, EPOP ratio, employment rate is, I think, very important to look at this.
Matt, did you want to say something?
Yeah. I just wanted to make a quick comment, fascinating research. And I think one had mentioned earlier the issue of long COVID, being disabled or as a result of illness. And I think that this is a question that I'm really interested in. I'm not sure that the data are yet be able to drill down into this, but something that should be looked at in the future, the extent to which the impact due to general labor market effects and the extent to which they're actually, like this point about support system, the extent to which they're actually people to withdraw from the labor force due to disability. And I think this is it's an underrated problem, and I think it's a problem we don't really have a good handle on yet, but it's something that I think a lot more attention needs to be paid to. So thanks very much.
Yeah, I see that we're almost out of time. What we all didn't talk about much is how much age discrimination is part of this phenomena, and I suspect that we need data on employers. American labor economists have really suffered by not having that, and we tend to then skew our theory towards supply side issues. And also, I think what Truc found is what Richard Johnson found in 2009. That there's something happening on the job, that the experience is not having the same kind of a reward that experience used to have. And whether that's because of changes in internal labor markets or commitment of employers to employees. But there just seems to be a lot of drive to make experience and age and specific human capital is not as important as before. But we need a lot more theory as well. But we can't do it without really knowing what's going on. So I really appreciate everybody's deep dive into the data and look for more on this, because after all, older workers are going to be the majority of the new workers in the next 10 years. That's just the logic of demographics and of change. And some industries are taking advantage of the desperation that older workers have in their business models, you know, with personal care and home health care work. So we really have to be very concerned about older workers becoming the new precariat, at least a big part of them. So I look forward to sharing this in our political economy of aging workshops, and hope that we've now become even a bigger community. Thanks very much for participating.